The smell hit him first. Sulfur and burnt copper, and something underneath that had no name in any human language. A sweetness that sat wrong in the lungs, like breathing perfume through a furnace. Don Michalak pressed his back against a pine and held very still, because the thing in the clearing was still watching. It had been watching for 6 minutes. He knew because he'd been counting. The assignment had seemed straightforward enough when he'd left the Survey Corps' forward base 3 days ago. Investigate the anomalous energy signature in Grid 7. Document what he found. Pull back. Standard recon protocol for a Class 3 contact zone. The Vorith had been operating in this sector for 4 months. Long enough that the brass had started calling it an occupation, rather than an incursion. Though nobody said that word in official briefings. What the brass also didn't say was that the Vorith had landed in 6 locations simultaneously, all of them chosen with a precision that suggested they had been watching Earth far longer than 4 months. They had chosen boreal forest, northern lakes, places where the rock was old and the trees ran for 1,000 kilometers in any direction, places where a human being, alone and unarmed, was very small. Don was very small. He was also, technically, unarmed. His survey kit included a radiation counter, a geological hammer, a flask of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and a sketchbook. The sketchbook was because he had a habit, left over from the years before the war, of drawing things before he reported them. His mother had taught him that. She'd been a botanist. She'd told him that the act of drawing something forced you to actually look at it, really look, instead of just seeing what you expected to see. He was looking at the Vorith now. The one in the clearing was approximately 3 meters tall in its current configuration, though configuration was the right word. It had a resting posture and an alert posture, and at least 2 others catalogued in the 6 minutes since it had stopped moving, each one involving a rearrangement of the 4 upper limbs in ways that did not follow any skeletal logic he understood. Its skin, if skin was what it was, shifted between a dark gunmetal gray and a deep amber brown, depending on how the light hit it. 2 of its sensory clusters, he refused on principle to call them eyes, were oriented toward his tree. He had not moved. He did not think it had seen him, he thought, but was not certain that Vorith's sensory apparatus was primarily thermal and motion-based, which meant that standing completely still in the shade of a large conifer might be enough. Might be. 6 minutes was a long time to stand on a might be. He opened the sketchbook slowly and began to draw. His hand was shaking. He let it shake and drew anyway, because the shaking didn't matter as long as the pencil kept moving. The creature's outline resolved itself onto the page. The mass of it, the 4 limbs, the 2 shorter manipulator appendages, folded against what he assumed was a thorax. The sensory clusters, the pattern of what appeared to be venting structures along the dorsal ridge. 7 of them, arranged in a grid roughly the size of a dinner plate. He had seen what those vents did in the footage from the 3rd Calgary incident. He did not want to see it in person. He drew until his hand stopped shaking. The Vorith in the clearing turned away. Don did not move for another 4 minutes. Then, very carefully, he lowered himself to one knee and pulled out the radiation counter. The readings were elevated. Not dangerously, not yet, but elevated. The same signature he'd first picked up 2 kilometers back, growing steadily stronger as he'd approached the clearing. The Vorith didn't appear to notice the faint click of the instrument, or it noticed and didn't care. He wasn't sure which possibility was worse. He marked the reading in his sketchbook, beside the drawing, and wrote the time. Then he started back toward base. He made it 400 meters before the second one stepped out of the trees. It was different from the first, larger, the dorsal vents more pronounced, the coloring almost entirely gunmetal, with no amber at all. It stood directly in his path, and it was absolutely, unmistakably looking at him. Not at the trees, not at the space above his head. At him specifically, with the kind of focused attention that Don had only ever seen in predators. He stopped walking. The Vorith made a sound. It was not a sound the human ear was designed for. It sat at the edge of subsonic, more felt in the sternum than heard, and it carried harmonics that seemed to bypass the brain's audio processing entirely and arrive somewhere older, the hindbrain, the part that had been telling primates to freeze when something large moved in the tall grass for several million years. Don's hindbrain was screaming. He reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out the flask. The coffee was cold. That was fine. He wasn't thirsty. He unscrewed the cap with one hand, keeping his eyes on the Vorith, and took a careful sip. His mother had done this, had taken a sip of tea before anything difficult, a habit so small and automatic that it had passed from her to him without either of them noticing it happening. He hadn't thought about it until right now, standing in the northern woods with an alien 3-meter tall blocking his path. He thought about her for a moment. The smell of her field jacket, the way she'd laugh at her own bad puns, the botanical drawings she'd done in the same kind of sketchbook he was carrying now. Then he looked at the Vorith and thought, it doesn't know what I'm going to do. That's the only advantage I have, and I should use it. He spoke. I'm a survey technician, he said, conversationally, the way you might talk to yourself on a long walk. I'm mapping radiation signatures. I don't have any weapons. I'd like to go back to my base camp. He paused. I'm going to walk around you, if that's all right. The Vorith did not respond in any way he could interpret. He walked around it. He kept his pace even and his shoulders level, and he did not run, because everything he'd read in the contact briefings suggested that the Vorith registered rapid movement as aggression, and because running would have meant admitting that his legs were not entirely trustworthy right now. He walked. He counted steps. He got to 30 before he allowed himself to look back. The Vorith was watching him go. He walked for another kilometer before he let himself breathe properly. The base camp was a research station that had been a fishing lodge before the incursion, 2 cabins, and a generator shed at the edge of a lake, about as far from anything as you could get and still have road access. There were 6 of them stationed there. Don, 2 other survey techs named Priya and Osterman, a communications specialist called Reyes, who everyone privately suspected had been posted here as some kind of punishment, and 2 soldiers whose official purpose was security and whose actual daily purpose was being bored. Sergeant Carla Voss was one of the soldiers. She was sitting on the cabin steps when Don walked in, cleaning her sidearm, and she looked at his face and set the cleaning kit down. How bad? 2 of them, less than half a kilometer from the eastern perimeter. He sat down next to her and put his head back against the cabin wall. One of them let me walk past. Let you. I talked to it. Voss was quiet for a moment. What did you say? I told it I was a survey tech and I wanted to go around it. He paused. I also introduced myself. I don't know why. It seemed like the right thing to do. Voss picked up the cleaning kit again. My grandmother used to say that you should always introduce yourself to something before you decide whether to be afraid of it. Did it help? She was talking about dogs. She ran a cloth along the barrel of the sidearm, but I think the principle probably extends. Don pulled out the sketchbook and looked at the drawing. It was a good drawing, better than he'd expected, given the shaking, and it captured something about the creature's mass and arrangement that the official surveillance photos hadn't, something about the way it held itself. The Vorith's posture in every official photo was aggressive, threatening, oriented toward destruction. The one he'd drawn had a different quality to it, watchful, patient. It was looking at something when I first found it, he said. In the clearing. It wasn't moving, it was just standing there, looking at the rock formation on the north side. Looking at rock, the way you'd look at something that interested you. He traced the outline of the dorsal vents with his finger, not touching the page. The Falcon Lake incident, the original one in '67. The old civilian reports said the craft landed near a quartz vein. An amateur prospector found it. The government spent years trying to explain the radiation readings, the burns, the grid pattern on his chest. They never could. He looked up. What if they weren't here to fight, the first time? What if they were here to look? Voss chambered the cleaned sidearm and holstered it without looking at him. That's a beautiful theory, she said. It doesn't explain the 3rd Calgary incident. No, he agreed. It doesn't. The Vorith came to the camp on the 4th day, not to attack. They came to the perimeter and stopped, 3 of them, at the tree line, and they stood there in the way they had. Patient, massive, utterly unhurried, while the camp scrambled, and Voss got her soldiers into position, and Reyes sent a contact report that would take 45 minutes to reach anyone who could do anything about it. Don walked to the perimeter. He was aware in a distant way that Voss was telling him not to do this. He was also aware that the 3 Vorith had not activated their dorsal vents, had not assumed the aggressive configuration documented in the Calgary footage, and were not moving. They were waiting. He didn't know what for. He thought perhaps he should find out. He stopped about 6 meters from the nearest one and looked up at it, and it looked back at him with its sensory clusters, and he reached into his jacket and pulled out the sketchbook. He opened it to the drawing he'd made 4 days ago and held it up. The Vorith looked at it. He couldn't be certain of that. Couldn't be certain it was looking at the drawing rather than at him. But something in its posture shifted slightly. Not the aggressive realignment. Something else. The kind of shift you'd make if something surprised you or caught your attention. He turned to a blank page and slowly drew the Vorith in front of him. He drew for 6 minutes. The Vorith did not move. The other two held their positions. Behind him, he could hear Voss breathing in the controlled way she did when she was deciding whether to shoot something. When he finished, he held the drawing up. The Vorith reached forward with one of its manipulator appendages, and very carefully did not quite touch the page. Stopped just short of it. The appendage tip was close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from it. Not intense, but present, like holding your hand near a lamp. He could see the texture of the manipulator, fine-grained, like old leather worn smooth. He thought about his mother looking at a plant she'd never seen before, kneeling in the undergrowth to get close, sketching it in her notebook. He turned the sketchbook toward the Vorith so it could see the page more clearly. A sound came from it. Not the subsonic aggression tone he'd heard in the woods. Something with a different quality, shorter, more complex, the harmonics arranged differently. He didn't know what it meant. He suspected he wouldn't know what it meant for a very long time, if ever, but it felt like something. He said, "My name is Don Michalak. I'm a survey technician. I've been mapping radiation signatures in this sector for 3 days. He paused. I think you've been here a lot longer than 4 months. I think you've been watching us for a while. I don't know why you started the war. I don't know if you think of it as a war." He stopped. The Vorith's sensory clusters were fully oriented on him. "I'd like to know what you're looking for. I think we might actually be looking for the same things." The Vorith made the complex sound again. Then it stepped back, and the 3 of them turned, and they walked into the trees. The debrief lasted 2 days. Don sat in a gray room at a base he couldn't name on a map he hadn't been allowed to keep, and answered questions from people who wore rank insignia but no name tags, and showed them the sketchbook, and described everything he'd observed with the precision his mother had taught him, and the Survey Corps had refined. Priya and Osterman corroborated from their positions. Reyes confirmed the contact report. Voss filed her own report, which she described as consistent with the survey team's account, and left it at that. Nobody asked Don what he thought it meant. He told them anyway. "They're not invaders," he said, or they weren't, originally. The Falcon Lake incident, the other pre-contact signatures, they were survey missions. The same as ours. They were mapping something. Possibly us. Possibly something else. He looked at the people in the gray room. The war started because someone shot at them. That's in the declassified military files from the first contact event. We shot first, not because we were aggressive. Because we were afraid, and we didn't understand what they were, and something moved fast in the dark, and someone pulled a trigger. He spread his hands. They have the same instinct, different trigger, but the same basic problem. He paused. The one I showed the drawing to, I think it recognized the gesture, the act of drawing something to understand it. I think it was doing the same thing when I first saw it in the clearing. I think it recognized what I was doing because it was already doing it. The room was quiet. "You can't build a ceasefire sketch," one of the rank insignia said. "No," Don agreed, "but you can build one on a shared recognition, the moment where 2 entities look at each other and realize they're the same kind of thing." He thought about the heat radiating from the manipulator appendage, the sound that had felt like something. That's how it starts with animals. That's how it started with humans. Historically, every time 2 groups of us met and didn't kill each other, someone looked at someone else and thought, "You're doing what I do. You're curious about what I'm curious about. You're afraid of the same dark." He picked up the sketchbook. You just have to get to that moment before someone pulls a trigger. The debrief ended without resolution, as debriefs tend to. He was told to return to base and continue his survey assignment, pending further orders. He shook hands with the rank insignia and walked out into the afternoon light and found Voss leaning against a transport vehicle, waiting. "How'd it go?" "They listened," he said. "I think. It's hard to tell." Voss handed him a cup of coffee. It was hot. He hadn't had hot coffee since the morning before he'd first seen the Vorith in the clearing. He held the cup in both hands and felt the warmth work its way into his palms, and thought about his mother's field jacket, and the smell of boreal pine, and the way the Vorith had stopped just for a moment, just short of touching the page, as if it understood that the drawing was something delicate. "What do you think happens next?" Voss asked. He drank the coffee. It was very good. "I think someone sends a different kind of team," he said, "with better equipment and more time and people who speak more languages than I do." He looked at the trees at the edge of the base, and I think if they're patient enough and careful enough and they don't shoot anything, it might actually work. And if they do shoot something, then we're back where we started. He finished the coffee. But I think we've been back where we started enough times to know that it doesn't work. He handed back the cup. "Sooner or later, you have to try the other thing." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Your mother would have liked this assignment." He thought about that. The botanical sketchbooks, the way she'd kneel in the undergrowth to look at something new, the patience she'd had with things that couldn't talk back. "Yeah," he said, "she would have." He pulled out the sketchbook and turned to a fresh page and began from memory to draw the Vorith at the tree line. Its posture, the way it held itself when it wasn't being aggressive, that watchful, patient, genuinely curious stillness that nobody in the official briefings had thought to mention. He drew it the way his mother had taught him, slowly and with care, looking at the thing itself rather than what he expected to see. The afternoon light came through the trees at a low angle, and the radiation counter in his pocket was quiet. And somewhere, in the forest, to the north, he suspected, something very large was doing exactly the same thing.